Close the borders, open the schools. That's the new rallying cry of backbench Tory MPs in a bid to keep out new COVID strains. And in response to the government briefing, homeschooling could continue past Easter. For once, might they have a point? Now, on schools, the answer is probably not. On borders, for once, we might be on the side of Priti Patel. A stopped clock can tell the right time twice a day, I suppose. But we'll get on to all of that. That's going to be a debate to be had. And wherever you stand, these are the two big issues of the week. I'll be discussing school closures with primary school teacher Chloe Tomlinson. And throughout the show, I'm joined by Ash Sarkar. Ash, my first question to you is not about schools or borders. It's about snow. Did you get out to enjoy it on Sunday, yesterday?
I did. I went out with a hot chocolate and romped around in the snow and just watched like the really little kids who were 1 or 2 years old who hadn't ever seen snow before just go completely like buck wild. So it's probably the most wholesome I've ever been in my life.
I had a very similar. I thought one thing that really struck me, it just felt like the first collective experience we'd all had that didn't involve a deadly disease in a really long time. So it's like, oh, we can all think and talk. The snow is something we have in common, not the fact that we're in the midst of a really gruesome pandemic. Later on the show, we'll also be discussing Therese Coffey's TV walkout and Robert Peston becoming a proponent of 2021's least convincing conspiracy theory. Make sure you stay tuned for that. As ever, do share the show link, tweet on the hashtag Tysky with your comments and your questions. Keep your super chats coming and leave your comments under the Twitch stream. So, this weekend, the Sunday Times reported that the government had ruled out schools opening after February half-term, so immediately after February half-term, and that they were likely to stay closed until Easter. On Sky News, Matt Hancock suggested closures could last even longer.
Are schools going to return at Easter?
Well, I would hope so, but we've got to look at the data. We've got to look at the impact of the vaccination programme.
So that's a don't know. You just don't know at this stage.
Well, we make these announcements as soon as we know. If we knew for sure, then of course we'd let everybody know. The Education Secretary said that he will ensure that schools have 2 weeks' notice of return, and I don't know whether it'll be before then or we've got to watch the data as we all do.
Now, what do we make of that answer? Now, on the one hand, saying we don't know is obviously completely reasonable. The government do need to be looking at the data to work out when it may not be, or when it may and may not be safe to reopen schools. On the other, it would be good if the government had a little bit more to say at this point. What are their plans to make schools safer? What are their plans to ensure that people can learn properly in a remote fashion, or potentially using rotas? How are they going to make schools safe? Instead, they just say, we're looking at the data. We can't tell you that much at the moment. Gavin Williamson obviously hasn't done anything for 10 months, as we've discussed many a time on this show before. And there's no doubt that what Matt Hancock said there will disappoint many parents and many students. We on this show have never underplayed the costs that school closures sort of put upon children, especially the children who are most disadvantaged. But before I go to our first guest, I want to point out that there is some opinions, some news reports, some political maneuvering about schools, which we don't have to take seriously. There are some serious concerns about education, and there are some people who are just absolute chancers who are trying to take the political debate here in a very toxic direction, as they have for the past 10 months. And to do so, I'm going to show you a couple of front pages from this morning. So this is the Daily Telegraph, and you can see their headline, as well as having a nice picture of the snow day: Tory revolt over closed schools. And if we go to the text in that story, they write, a dozen Conservative MPs, including the former Cabinet Minister Esther McVey and Sir Graham Brady, chairman of the 1922 Committee of Tory backbenchers, have backed a campaign by the parents' pressure group Us For Them to fully reopen schools. They argue that the school shutdown means education has become an optional extra, with the gulf between the most disadvantaged children and their wealthier peers growing by the day. Now, there's a couple of reasons not to take this headline particularly seriously. Actually, I'm going to say there's 3 reasons not to take this particularly seriously. One, the Daily Telegraph is the newspaper which has been most responsible, actually, for taking sort of political discourse, even if not public opinion, in a direction which is pretty anti-lockdown. The reason schools will need to be closed until Easter, if they do need to be closed until Easter, is because the government went into this lockdown so late. That's why numbers are so high. And it's the Daily Telegraph who've been pushing that line this whole pandemic. The second reason is that these are the same Tory backbench MPs who have been, really influencing Boris Johnson to have loose lockdown policies. When schools were closed and the rest of society was open, they weren't like, oh, this is working, let's keep it like this. They were like, no, let's open the shops, let's open the pubs. These are not people to be trusted. And finally, what I want you to focus on is this parent pressure group, Us for Them. Keep that in mind. I'm going to go into in a moment the details of why this group shouldn't necessarily be taken seriously as a thermometer for what parents are really thinking. The next front page I'm going to show you is The Sun. Get kids back to school. The Sun have played a similar role to the Daily Telegraph throughout this pandemic. They've been sort of pressuring people to go back into work in September, as we often talked about on this show. But I want to focus on Us for Them now, because they also form the backbone of this story. It's that 12 backbench MPs have signed up to the campaign from Us for Them being parents for the children, or adults for children, to have schools reopened much quicker than is the current government plan. Now, who are they? The Telegraph front page we showed you describes them as the following. They write, Us for Them is a volunteer organisation which was set up by parents and grandparents in response to the closure of schools last spring, and argues that if the government does not reopen schools, it must publish an assessment of the huge amount of harm being done to children. So we see this a volunteer organisation set up by parents and grandparents who are so virtuous that they want adults to be making sacrifices for the benefit of society's children. Now, there's a problem with this, because as the Byline Times have shown, this isn't a group of independent volunteer parents. In fact, they have some pretty close ties to the government they purport to be lobbying. Now, the main connection here is that it turns out Us for Them gets PR advice, or public relations advice, from a man called Ed Barker, who runs the communications firm SW1. Now, this Ed Barker, who gives campaign advice to Us for Them, is not only a former parliamentary candidate for the Conservatives, but was also a communications advisor to Boris Johnson's leadership campaign. And more significantly, and what I find more worrying, he currently manages PR for the COVID Recovery Group. Now, in case you haven't heard of the COVID Recovery Group, this is the group of Tory backbench MPs who are consistently agitating to loosen lockdowns and supposedly, get us as back to normal as possible so the economy can thrive. Obviously, that's a self-defeating policy. The sooner you open lockdowns, the worse in the long time that's going to be for the economy. But these people aren't necessarily interested in rational argument. Anyway, you can see a close connection here. The PR person of the Tory backbench COVID Recovery Group is very, very close to the Us for Them campaign, who launched the campaign. These are working together. Secondly, why we should be worried about them is because they are up to their necks in COVID denial. So Marta Kotlarek is Us for Them's web administrator. Here she is on Twitter. So she tweets, this is all what was revealed in that Byline Times article. So, when was the last time you took the test when you had a flu or common cold? If we all get tested, we would be living in never-ending lockdowns. Just stay home. This is it. No test equals no case equals no pandemic. So this is Trumpian stuff. This is proper COVID denial. And she's also here retweeting. Not sure why this is low-res version, but she's saying, loving each other, hands, face, embrace. So this is completely going against all the public health advice to say, let's completely forget about COVID and live as we normally do. The third reason, the founder of the group, Molly Kingsley, is a former corporate lawyer whose business partner worked in the cabinet office under David Cameron. This is all classic AstroTurf stuff. These are people who are being put forward by the right-wing media as the valid representatives of parents, and they are just pushing the lines of certain people within the cabinet, for example, Gavin Williamson, this seems to be the line that he's been very keen on pushing, but also right-wing Tory backbenchers, right-wing newspaper proprietors, and all of them, it's in their interest to pretend that this is an organic group instead of an AstroTurf one. It's worth saying, just to, in case you weren't already convinced, that these people don't represent ordinary parents. They were agitating very strongly against closing schools on the 4th of January this year. That was opposed by a vast majority of the public. It's difficult to say the precise breakdown among parents because the YouGov poll doesn't have that as a particular category, but you can see that here 62% of the public think it was the wrong decision to keep schools open on the 4th of January. Obviously, the policy changed that evening. And women, who we know from reporting are the people who are most likely to be providing care for kids out of school, they were even more in favour of closing schools than men. Of course, none of this is to suggest that closing schools doesn't come with genuine costs. And to discuss those, I'm joined by primary school teacher and NEU activist, Chloe Tomlinson. Chloe, welcome back to the show.
Hi.
We spoke to you just as school closures were announced last time. So first of all, I want a bit of an update on how is homeschooling going? How are you finding it? We hear a lot in the media worries that sort of especially disadvantaged kids are being completely left behind, that education is not really the same when it's remote. How have you sort of found this over the past couple of weeks?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely not the same when it's remote. It's very, very different. It's kind of like doing a completely different job. And most teachers teach because they love being in a classroom with children. They love that direct work that they do. And it is just a very different experience. Like, it's lots of planning and preparing lessons, lots of recording myself on Zoom, lots of checking Seesaw, the app we use, and sort of like commenting on work children uploaded, and very little of that direct interaction, which is how most learning takes place, and which is also like the really fun and wonderful bit of the job. So it's very different. It's kind of like doing a lot of the things I don't like about my job without many of the things that I do. But I also am finding it quite interesting. I think, it's very easy to kind of, it definitely is not a good thing. Children being at home, learning at home is not as good as them being in school, but there are some kind of surprising silver linings. I think, I spoke to a secondary school teacher recently, and actually it was quite interesting because she said a kind of similar thing, which is surprisingly there's some children who do actually respond quite well to it. There's some families who really take it in their stride, although I do think it is a lot of work for parents. And I think something that you definitely don't hear about is you really would assume that it is very much, middle-class children who are doing great at-home learning, and it's really disastrous for families who are on lower income. And I think, those sort of sweeping statements aren't actually true in my experience. I think two of the children who are doing sort of the most wonderful learning at home are really working class children on free school meals, one a part of a huge family. And I think actually for working parents, I've got a couple of middle class children in my class, and their parents are both working, and they're actually really finding it very difficult to stay on top of the work and finding it really stressful. So I think there's so many different factors which affect how children respond to it, also like their personal disposition. A secondary school teacher I spoke to recently was saying a weird side effect for them is that some of their pupils with special educational needs and with a lot of anxiety have felt much more able to ask for help from their teachers because they're less embarrassed of doing so in front of their peers, and they can kind of just put it quietly in the chat box in a private message. So yeah, definitely not ideal circumstances for learning, but there are, I've been pleasantly surprised with a few bits. And one thing, today I did I get once a week, I'm allowed to do a live Zoom with them, and that is genuinely like really, really lovely. And I think a big improvement from the feedback that I've had from parents generally on what was happening last year, like a lot higher level of provision and also a bit more kind of live interaction.
And what do you make then of this? Well, it's not an announcement yet. It was basically a government briefing that hasn't been denied, that it's unlikely really that schools will open before the Easter holiday. So there'll be a whole term of kids being at home. What do you make of that? Is that something that's a relief to you, or do you think that the government should be being, I suppose, more ambitious in terms of making schools safe enough to return to?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many different factors at play here. It's very hard to kind of have an opinion on, especially such a vague statement when so much could change between now and then. I think that, I mean, you know, almost come a little bit indirectly to that question. I find it really interesting that the Us for Them turned out to be an AstroTurf campaign, because I think how, you know, they've actually been the single high profile voice of parents against really what has been, you know, the education union and most teachers' positions kind of throughout this. And I think as a teacher and how most teachers feel is kind of similar to how most parents feel, in that, like, this is not ideal. We do not like remote teaching. It is, you know, it's kind of like probably longer hours, but like definitely less fun and less rewarding than our usual jobs. We have a duty of care for the children we teach. Like, I really deeply care about the children who I work with and feel a huge amount of responsibility for them. I have real, you know, worries about some of the children who I think maybe won't be coping as well with being at home, or who are maybe not hearing from as much. And to, you know, I don't like that situation of not being able to do my job and deliver the care that it is my job to deliver. But also, I do not want to be complicit in a plan that is going to have huge consequences for public health. And I really, really, really want this to be handled in a way that allows us to really address, you know, to address the kind of wider community transmission issues safely. And then as the sort of the first priority, and then as the second priority, to sort of say, look, these are our circumstances. Let's not have an instrumental approach, which is like, this is how we educated before the pandemic, so how can we try and replicate that now? And, you know, doesn't matter if it's not safe. Let's put safety for the community first, and then let's say, what are children's needs right now? How can we meet them? What sort of compromises are required in order to meet their needs? And their needs are going to be a little bit different. You know, I think we've got to be able to separate between the curriculum and the delivery of the curriculum, the formal curriculum, which I think can be actually caught up on quite well if a plan is put in place to do that later, and saying, you know, what are the really worrying ways in which children are sort of like not being given the opportunity to hit their developmental milestones? What are the repercussions for mental health which could go on to have a lifelong impact on children if they're not addressed? And for me, those are the two things I really, really, really want to see. So yes, I would genuinely love to be back in school with my class, you know, whenever I can be, but compromising on safety, like letting R go back up, letting the NHS get to where it's been in the last few weeks, absolutely no way. And also being back in school and it being like it was in December, when we knew it wasn't safe, when education was being really disrupted, and when basically just no measures have been put in place to try and address that. Like, absolutely no way.
And finally, what I suppose it's a question that sort of has two parts. Is what would make you feel comfortable going back into school with your students, either, you know, for your own personal safety, or for your students' personal safety, or their families? And then also, you know, what do you want the government to be saying? What do you want them to be promising to do that they haven't at this point? I mean, they haven't promised very much at all at this point. They're being very, very vague. But what would be something that Gavin Williamson could announce, and you'd be like, oh, actually, that was surprisingly, you know, meaningful. Yeah.
So in terms of what will make me feel safe to go back and work into work, I personally am fine with being in work. I don't feel particularly vulnerable. I've already had COVID. I almost definitely caught it in school last term. And I'm not too worried about my own safety. Now, I am actually really very worried about the safety of some of the staff I work with. And I do worry sometimes that some of the people, you know, maybe on the left who have not, you know, who have kind of not listened that carefully to what education staff are worried about, kind of maybe assume, like most teachers, that I am representative of the education workforce. And I think, you know, I think it's really important to say that, like, I am not. Like, the staff that I'm worried about are, you know, women, often women of colour in their 50s, who have underlying health conditions, who are incredibly poorly paid, if they are support staff, who are being asked to go into work on the bus every day. and be in workplaces where we know that there's a lot of transmission and where they cannot socially distance. Like special schools, support staff have 7 times the rate of most people, because that's kind of often the most extreme example of social distancing being very, very difficult in schools if you're working with children with special needs, but it's the case in primary as well. So I think, vaccinations, I think would be really good in terms of like that particular, what will make school workers feel safe. And for me, I would like it to be thought about like which groups of education workers are most at risk, and for the vaccination approach to kind of I would really like to know that my support staff who are in school at the moment have been vaccinated. That would be like really wonderful news. And then in terms of the sort of like bigger picture, which I think what Gavin Williamson could do, kind of would need to address the issues of staff safety, but also community transmission and also like learning. And I think because what's needed is very nuanced, like it will look very different for the year 2s that I teach to the sixth form college students that some of my colleagues teach. There's not like a one size fits all kind of response. However, there kind of is, because it's something that the NEU have been asking for from very early on in this pandemic, and it's something that actually Rebecca Bailey, when in her short term as education secretary, was brilliant at pushing for as well. And that's a joint education task force. Like the scale of what needs to be achieved, the level of nuance to all of the different arrangements and compromises that need to be found. Like I don't think that anyone from I don't think teachers can come up with it. I certainly don't think politicians could even with the best will in the world, could manage to come up with the right solutions to what is going to meet children's needs right now. I think groups of the education unions, also like parent interest groups, working with scientists, working with public health specialists, all of this, like then we could maybe start to agree on the kind of compromises that are going to work. So I think that is really what is required. It's a complete shift in the attitude towards education workers more than anything else, because the NEU put together a plan in June for how to make schools safe this year. Many of the things on that plan are still like, it's like bigger, more classroom spaces, smaller class sizes, ventilation. It all still holds, but the government completely threw out, and Labour have been no better on this, have turned working with teachers into something like political, and prefer to make out like we're just these really unreasonable, self-interested group who they couldn't possibly work with, rather than actually collaborate with us to put in the measures that are needed.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think anyone thinks that Gavin Williamson's done a particularly good job over the past 10 months. Chloe Tomlinson, thank you so much for joining us again this evening, providing your always wonderful insights. I'm sure we'll speak again soon.
Thanks very much, Michael.
Let's get a comment up before we go to our next section. Jane Lean with £22. Thank you very much. My son Geordie is 22 today. I suppose that's why it was that amount. He's become a big fan of Novara Media too. Thanks for helping him through. Oh, happy birthday, Geordie. I'm very glad you have become a fan. And we'll go to more comments throughout the show. For now, share the show stream if you haven't already. We want to get more people watching this live. I've said the 2 big issues of the week seem to be schools and borders. We've done schools. We're going to go on to borders because it seems that there has been a bit of a volte-face in terms of the Conservatives' approach to travel restrictions in this pandemic. Now, officially, that's because of concerns about bringing a new strain into the country, which could undermine efforts to vaccinate the population. It's probably also, I think, because of a recognition that those countries which did sort of implement very strong travel restrictions at the start of this pandemic were right to do so. They've had way fewer deaths, than those countries which kept their borders open. So I don't think the government are going to be willing to admit they made a massive mistake, but I think it's clear they did. Anyway, now what's going on is there is apparently a bit of a power struggle going on in government about what particular policy should be adopted. They all agree that we do need some sort of stricter border policy than we had before, but they disagree about what exactly it will look like. So the FT had a story on this. So they write, the Prime Minister is likely to agree to quarantine in a hotel, but no decision has been taken on whether this will be required for all arrivals or whether it will be decided on a country-by-country basis. Travel industry insiders say government departments have held meetings with representatives of major hotel chains in recent days about how their hotels could be used for quarantine arrivals. The Cabinet's COVID Operations Committee will meet on Tuesday to decide when and how to introduce hotel quarantine, along with other options for tightening the UK's borders, including whether to impose a blanket ban on all arrivals and departures. According to government officials, Health Secretary Matt Hancock and Home Secretary Priti Patel are arguing all arrivals should face quarantine, while Transport Secretary Grant Shapps and Chancellor Rishi Sunak believe it should be more selective. Now, this is a very familiar story because once again, you've got people like Matt Hancock, the Health Secretary, and now, in fact, Priti Patel, arguing for a tough measure, saying anyone who comes into the country will have to quarantine in a hotel on a mandatory basis. And then you've got people like Rishi Sunak who are pushing for a much more lax option. They're saying, actually, maybe we only need to quarantine the people who've come from where we have recognized a COVID strain is, currently very prolific. The obvious problem with that is that, as the government keep telling us, most countries don't do actually that much genomic sequencing of these COVID strains. And it's going to take, a lot of people will have traveled from a country to this country before we realize where those dangerous strains are. So it would be stupid to say we can prevent this threat by just restricting travel from those places where we know there is already a threat. Anyway, on which side Boris Johnson will fall, it's still a little bit unclear, but he gave some indication when asked today what his plans were with regard to travel restrictions.
One of the issues, obviously, this week for you will be the borders, controlling the borders, seeing who comes in and leaves. One of the arguments is for a quarantine hotel. Can you confirm that quarantine hotels is something that you're actively looking at?
We're definitely looking at, but I've got to tell you, at the moment, the UK already has one of the tightest regimes in the world. So don't forget, everybody, when you're coming into the UK, coming back from the UK, you have to have a test 72 hours before you fly. You have to have a passenger locator form. The airline will kick you off if you don't produce either of those, a negative test or a passenger locator form. And then you've got to quarantine for 10 days or 5 days if you get another negative test.
So spoiler, the UK doesn't already have one of the toughest regimes in the world. So what he's providing us is evidence for the toughest regime. We require people to have a negative test. Now, we've only required that for a couple of weeks. Most countries have been requiring a negative test since the summer. If any of you trying to go abroad in the summer, Spain, Greece, all of these places saying you need a test before you come here. Britain only just woke up to that reality. He's saying also, if you come here, you have to quarantine for 10 days at home and you have to fill out a form. This isn't particularly tough. As we know, only 22% of people actually quarantine for the required amount of time. I'm going to go to a few more details from Sebastian Payne from the FT in a moment about what the government are thinking. First of all, I want to get Ash in. What's your take on this? I know our sort of position, our official position on Novara isn't normally for, pull up the drawbridges, let's have really tight border restrictions. But is this a moment where we should make an exception?
Look, we know that new strains are popping up, which might be more transmissible, as with the case of the Kent variant, or potentially even, as rumours swirled around the South African variant, this hasn't actually been backed up a huge amount, potentially vaccine resistant. So as more strains pop up, it's more risky in terms of our own vaccination rollout. And so I think that it is wise to have some kind of travel restriction. I don't think that it's right that we have had such a lax policy of people coming in for a really long time without showing even a negative test, and that also there haven't been sufficient checks on adhering to quarantine when they get here. So I had to quarantine when I came back from the Netherlands after teaching in October. Not one phone call, not one text, not one knock on the door, absolutely no means of checking whether or not I was adhering to that quarantine. And luckily I was, because it turns out I actually had coronavirus. But there was absolutely nothing in place to make sure that was going on. The question then is, how do you have some kind of stricter border regime, which normally we wouldn't be asking for, which doesn't severely imperil and make life much harder for the most vulnerable kinds of migrant, the most vulnerable kinds of people who move across borders? Well, at present, we don't have a great situation for the treatment of asylum seekers. If you look at what's going on in Napier Barracks, there are 120 cases of coronavirus at the moment. It's growing because the people there who are asylum seekers can't self-isolate. They can't social distance. So if this government wanted to take safety seriously when it comes to people coming to this country, just sort of bundling a load of really vulnerable people together and not letting them leave a place where they can't, social distance is probably a really bad idea. So what you would want to do is look at the people who are currently, really incarcerated, right? They're incarcerated by some of the most brutal bits of our border system. You want some kind of policy of test and release, whether that's releasing to family members who are already in this country or other kinds of supported accommodation. The next thing is, well, what do you do about people who really do need to come to this country? Maybe there's a funeral, maybe there's a case of extreme sickness, there's a need for family reunion. You are going to have to come up with some kind of set of criteria for assessing the relative importance of different reasons for coming here while this pandemic is going on. I think that would be a much fairer way to do it than the situation that you find in Australia, where basically the people who can afford these really extortionate fees for getting back into the country are the ones that make it through. So there is a fairer way to do it. Obviously, stricter border controls isn't something I want. It's not something you want. And I don't think that at present it's even the most important pillar of our pandemic management. We should be more worried about the cases we export rather than the ones that we import, looking at our dreadful infection numbers. But when we get the R rate lower and we're trying to have that vaccine rollout be the last word in the matter, monitoring the people that come here, the kind of strains which might be going on elsewhere, is going to be a really central part of that. And it's an unfortunate fact of the situation we're in. Michael, you're muted.
In the middle of your flow. I'm muted. The reason I was muted is I was about to say sorry for dropping something in the middle of your flow. Next time I take a sip of my tea, I will make sure to mute my mic.
Did you throw it at the wall in outrage?
It was a poster that stuck to the bottom of the cup and then it fell down. I wasn't at all angry at what you were saying. I want to go to a Sebastian Payne thread about what the government are thinking about some of the practical difficulties of this. So he tweeted this today, very well connected with Downing Street, I'm sure. He says there are currently 8,000 people a day coming into the UK. If all arrivals were funneled through Heathrow, there are 10,000 beds in the vicinity, so it would be filled within a day and a half. Which other airports, hotels will be involved? How could people be safely transported? The same amount of people coming to this country, the hotels will be full pretty quickly, or the hotels next to airports will be full pretty quickly. He writes, ministers are assuming the number of people coming to the UK would reduce dramatically if hotel quarantine is introduced, but the logistics of keeping thousands of people isolated, fed and watered is vast. Even the smallest of gaps will undermine the whole strategy. Now, some of these challenges I think we should take less seriously than others. It's like, how are we going to give these people water? It's a hotel. How are we going to give these people food? You can sort of see how low Britain's state capacity is at the moment, where they're like, but if we quarantine people, what if they all starve? You're one of the most developed, richest governments in the world. I'm sure you could feed some people in a hotel. The bigger problem, though, is capacity, because moving people to hotels away from airports, you've got a bit of a super spreader event there. If you're bustling people onto coaches to get them to, a hotel in London, for example, what if they all catch COVID from each other on that bus? Let's go on. So how to solve this problem? He writes, one option is to introduce a cap on arrivals, as has been done in Australia. Sydney allows just 1,505 arrivals a week. Other cities are in the hundreds. But as Sarah Nixon has pointed out, it has created an economic and human crisis in Oz. Flight prices have soared. Now, I think that human crisis there is quite real. In many cases, Australians can't return to Australia because they live abroad and they can't afford the high prices which are now being charged, given that you have to pay for your own quarantine, and also because there are so few flights. I imagine the airlines are hiking up the prices. As Ash said as well, there's probably people who aren't Australian citizens but who need to get there for one reason or the other. My personal opinion is that even though those downsides are very real, the downsides of having a looser border restriction is probably greater. So, in Australia, they can go to gigs at the moment, right? And that's because they've got this fairly authoritarian border policy for a temporary period of time, which means they can continue life, as normal. All the downsides of closing schools they don't have to confront in Australia because COVID isn't really around at the moment. I want to go straight onto the politics of this because some Labour politicians, we saw Keir Starmer try and do it at last week's Prime Minister's Questions, are trying to make hay out of the fact that Boris Johnson was very late to introduce border restrictions. He mentioned that at PMQs. There is now a Labour outrider group called One Rule for Them, who are trying to capitalise on Johnson's failure to close borders at the start of the pandemic. Now, according to The Guardian, One Rule for Them take inspiration from the Lincoln Project. They're a group of anti-Trump Republicans who put out sort of Trump attack ads during the general election, the presidential election in the United States. But whilst the Lincoln Project was from sort of ex-Republicans, this one is from people quite close to the Labour Party. So One Rule for Them is run by a former Labour advisor, Adam McNicholas. And we can take a look at the video, which is being targeted at Northern Red Wall seats.
Borders. When a global pandemic begins, it makes sense to close them quickly. So what happened in Britain? The World Health Organization declared coronavirus a public health emergency in January 2020. Countries around the world acted quickly, stopping flights and shutting their borders. Britain didn't. The Home Secretary was calling for borders to be closed during the outbreak, but Boris Johnson wouldn't budge. Even Afghanistan had tighter controls than Britain. For a year, Boris Johnson left our borders wide open. A year of new cases arriving through our airports, leaving our families, friends, and our NHS exposed. No checks, no enforcement. It took a year for Boris Johnson to close our borders, but it's too late. Other island nations like New Zealand, where life is back to normal, shut their borders when the crisis began. Boris Johnson left Britain exposed.
So there are a number of problems with that video. I'm going to get Ash to explain most of them, I think. The first one I just want to mention is that this really is sort of Captain Hindsight type stuff, because the Labour Party at the beginning of this pandemic were not saying, let's close the borders. In fact, even the World Health Organization at the beginning of this pandemic weren't saying close the borders. So whilst we might say, our government have been particularly slow compared to a country like Spain, New Zealand is really the exception here. Well, in terms of European countries, it was Australia, New Zealand, and the East Asian countries that were very good at this. They were proved right. But Boris Johnson wasn't particularly unique in not closing borders at the start of this pandemic, and the Labour Party weren't asking him to. That's the sort of, the historical record here. Ash, I want to go to you about the sort of more general points being made in that video. Voters are being told, we're worse than Afghanistan.
I mean, look, that video is pure ideology. And this is why I feel uncomfortable talking about border restrictions within the context of coronavirus, because I'm talking about it as a very time-limited measure in response to the risks posed by a new strain. But there's a lot of room for slippage into a more generalized anti-immigrant, xenophobic kind of worldview. And that's what's going on in this video. First, just look at the style of it. It looks exactly like, those Channel 5 daytime programs, which are called like Border Force. And it's all about customs agents, quite often in Australia as well, but Britain too, going through people's bags at airports and sniffing out an undocumented migrant here or some kind of contraband in the hand luggage there. It's in that exact same style of kind of paranoiac security state. This is our last line of defense kind of thing. You've then got the message about Afghanistan, because the framing of Afghanistan is very different from New Zealand. It wasn't praise for Afghanistan's handling of the coronavirus. The implicit message there was even shit countries like Afghanistan, that one that we bombed, is doing better than us. Whereas New Zealand is, look, civilized New Zealand. So really, really quite terrible stuff there. And the reason why it's being targeted at so-called red wall voters is because they think that this is a way for Labour to do anti-immigrant politics without having to actually do anti-immigrant politics. So they're serving that wedge of their lost electorate without having to fully move away from the kinds of values which are held by the Labour grassroots.
I think that's a very good summary of that video. It's pretty gross. It does show a very crass understanding of how Labour can win back the red wall as well. I suppose that's the only way I could kind of make sense of that, because obviously the conclusion from watching that isn't, I should vote Labour then. Because, you know, Labour doesn't, if what you want is really tough borders, you're not going to think, oh, Boris Johnson was weak, so I'm going to vote for Keir Starmer, who, one, didn't call for tougher borders during the coronavirus pandemic, and two, you know, ran in the last election on the platform of free movement within the EU. So the only way I can see it as making electoral sense is if it's a voter suppression tactic. So it's sort of saying to these people, obviously you're not going to vote Labour, but also maybe don't vote Tory. In fact, maybe you should vote for an even further right party, which is obviously playing with fire. That's very dangerous. That's what the Americans did when they tried to the Democrats tried to promote Donald Trump because they thought he'd be an easier target against Hillary Clinton. It turns out actually what they did was they, made possible 4 years of white supremacy in the White House. So this idea that you can push far right voters further to the right so they don't vote for the Conservatives, I'm not sure that's the game we should be playing. I'm going to go to a couple of super chats. Gavin Bedford with 20 quid, secondary school teacher here. Fascinated to hear primary experience. Been so impressed with our kids. 96% online every day, averaging 300 minutes on learning platform. Year 11 showing such resilience ahead of government madness. Inspiring. That's really good to hear, Gavin. I'm very, that sounds super impressive. I mean, I suppose one thing we need is data to see how generalized this isn't, because we're constantly just hearing on front pages from people like Us for Them. None of this is very evidence based. But that is a great comment. Thank you for that. Owen Garland with 50 Swedish krona. One of the reasons I love Tysky Sour is it's so cozy and friendly. News doesn't have to be hostile. Love to the team, guests, and the viewers. Lovely comment, Owen. Thank you. Oh, it's a joy to spend our cozy Monday, Wednesday, and Friday evenings with you.
They clearly don't know that you bully me behind the scenes. It's actually a very toxic workplace environment. Sometimes he's just WhatsApping me as I'm talking, going, idiot.
Yeah.
Really?
Well, actually, in that last section, I was like, I'm going to smash something just while you're speaking, because I think it's so nonsensical. And then Fox silenced me, put me on mute to try and get me under control.
Yeah, just so I wouldn't cry on air again.
Let's go on to our next section. Between April and November last year, the Tory government boycotted ITV's Good Morning Britain. That was because they got tired of their ministers getting attacked so heavily, so repeatedly by Piers Morgan. Since then, though, since they've come back on, it was since Dominic Cummings left Downing Street, it has once again become a ritual for government ministers to have their failures read out to them by the host, by Piers Morgan. The latest to take the hot seat was Work and Pension Secretary Therese Coffey.
If, as you say, we've done all the right things, can you explain why we currently have the worst death rate in the world? And can you explain why we have one of the highest death tolls in the world? If we did everything right, how have we ended up here?
Well, as I say, we've been learning throughout this process, working with scientific advisors on trying to take the appropriate policies. There'll be a variety of reasons why people, unfortunately, have died due to this. Some of that will be recognising the age of our population. Some of that will be recognising the obesity of our population. But we've been learning throughout how we can improve the different ways of trying to help people during this. At the same time, I'm very conscious of the economic impact it's had, particularly on young people. That's why we are trying to do what we can with education. It's why we've created Kickstart. It's why we're trying to make it
but
even
just to
simpler.
clarify.
So we've heard all this before. That was very similar to the interview that Priti Patel gave, where they asked, why is our death rate the highest in the world? That's not the total deaths per population is the highest in the world, but the total number who are dying at the moment every day is the highest in the world. Priti Patel blamed ethnic minorities. And now Therese Coffey is blaming old people and obese people. She's saying it's just demographics, nothing to do with government policy. It's because Britain is particularly old and particularly obese. Now, I don't think you're going to find that particularly convincing, but I do still want to go through the facts to show you how wrong it is, right? So let's take her at her word with this age example. Now, in terms of median age, the UK is the 50th oldest country in the world, not towards the top. The median age in the UK is 40 compared to 47 in Japan and Germany, who are number 2 and number 3, respectively. They've obviously got much lower death tolls than Britain has. Monaco is first, but super small state, so I'm not really including it. The fairer comparison, though, because I like to be fair, is not so much the median age, but the number of very old people in your society, because we know that COVID-19 in particular is very deadly for people who are over 80 and over 70 as well. Does lots of harm, can do lots of harm to people of all age groups. But in terms of the number of people who are going to die, your over 80s is very important. Here, Britain is 10th. So this is from the World Bank, showing you the proportion of the population in each of these countries. These are the highest countries who are over 80. So in Japan, you can see 6% of the population are over 80. In Greece and Italy, 6% as well. In Germany, 5% of the population are over 80. And then you have to go down to number 10 for the United Kingdom, where 4% of the population are over 80. So you can see that the United Kingdom, not quite the 50th, but still the 10th. It's not at the top of countries with the highest proportion of over 80s. And how does this compare to the number of people who died over the course of this pandemic? So I plotted a graph on Our World in Data, showing all of those countries that you can see in the top 10 there, apart from Hong Kong, actually, because they don't have data, and the number of people who have died per million people in that country. So you can see here, Belgium comes out on top. So the United Kingdom hasn't done the worst of anyone in the world, but the United Kingdom is second there. We've had the second highest death toll of those 10 countries, even though all of the countries plotted on this graph have a larger proportion of their population over 80 than we do. So you cannot explain Britain's terrible death toll with reference to age. Just to take one example, if you look at the United Kingdom there, we've had 1,400 people die per million, whereas Germany has had 600 people die per million. So twice as many people have died in Britain as a proportion of the population, even though Germany has a much larger 80 plus population than us. They have 5% of the population who are 80 plus. We have 4% of the population. Obviously, Japan is doing much better than anyone else there. What about obesity? That was the other thing she brought up. Obesity, we're only the 36th most obese country in the world. That's with 20% of the population classed as obese. So again, these excuses do not stack up. What does make the difference is the speed at which you go into lockdown. So a study from Imperial College found that by delaying for a week the lockdown in March, Boris Johnson caused 21,000 extra deaths. He made the same mistake again this time round. And you don't need a degree in epidemiology to understand why. We consistently see death rates level off about 2 weeks after a lockdown is implemented. It's happening right now in Britain because we're 2 weeks after that lockdown came in, or about 3 now. And it's quite easy to understand this on these terms. So the reason our death rate at the moment is leveling off at about 1,200 is because when we went into lockdown, our average daily cases was 60,000. If we'd gone into a lockdown 2 weeks earlier when Sage had asked for it, when average daily cases were 30,000, then deaths would have leveled off at about 600 a day, right? So that is why we are having 1,200 deaths a day. It's not because of a new strain. It's because we went into lockdown incredibly late, much later than other comparable countries. Let's go back to that interview, actually, because Piers Morgan did not let Therese Coffey get away with that answer. Here's what happened next.
I applaud you for giving us some reasons, because
that's the first time we've heard a government minister settle on a couple of explanations.
Right. None of your colleagues last week could give us any. So you've given us two now: ageing population and obesity. So are you saying that the reason for us having the worst death rate in the world is because of the public? They're too old and they're too fat.
I think that's a very insulting thing that you've just said.
You just said it.
Is unconscious that there's a variety of factors which will have led to people sadly being ill during this time, sadly that translating into deaths. I'm conscious that this is a very serious impact. Our own Prime Minister was in hospital in intensive care himself last April. I'm conscious that we are wanting to make sure we have a wraparound support.
Sorry, what did you find insulting,
which we have done
Ms.
throughout
Coffey?
this
Out of interest, what did you find insulting? You said two reasons for the fact we had the worst.
I also need to point out that you started this interview late. Unfortunately, I have to go to other broadcasters as well. And I wish that we'd had more time when we were.
Well, you can come back anytime. We haven't seen you.
I appreciate that.
I haven't interviewed you since May, so you can come back anytime. It was you that boycotted the programme, right? So please don't play. Please don't play the "you haven't given me enough time" card, because we gave you 8 months and you didn't turn up.
Let me ask you this. Much for this. Yeah, but we were due to start at 8:15.
I understand it.
I'm really excited about the opportunity to kickstart for young people.
I understand.
But I'm sorry, Piers. I'm going to have to go to another broadcaster.
I just wanted you to clarify. Given you said I was insulting.
Piers, I'm sorry. I'm going to have to go.
You're going to go. You're not going to explain why you think I was the one insulting.
You've already had 20 minutes of my time. I appreciate your time as well. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Wow. Okay. Thank you, Miss Coffey.
So that was a very weak answer from Therese Coffey. She's saying, Piers Morgan is quite rightly saying, so you're saying this is just because there's old people and fat people in this country. She's like, that's a very insulting thing to say. He was exactly right. He was just repeating back to her what she said, but, you know, dressed up in less flowery language. The walking out bit, that's got a lot of attention. It was, you know, you probably shouldn't do that as a politician because it makes you look very bad. She does actually have a leg to stand on there, though. The Politico email in the morning tells you at what time every politician is supposed to be on what station. She was due to be on Radio 4 at 8:30. That sort of, you know, beef happened at 8:31. I'm going to go to Ash in one moment. First of all, we unfortunately do not get to grill government ministers, but maybe if we get big enough, we can. Imagine the scenes. Imagine the scenes. I would love it. Please do go to support.Novara Media so that we can grow, and hit the subscribe button because, as you know, this show goes live every Monday, Wednesday and Friday at 7 p.m. Ash, what did you make of that exchange between Piers Morgan and Therese Coffey?
Oh, God, she's not exactly, you know, a strong performer, a big hitter. I don't think that, you know, an interviewer like Piers Morgan or even Andrew Marr or Andrew Neil would feel particularly worried about Therese Coffey being able to parry away their questions with panache and skill. It's really quite wooden and not particularly dynamic. The problem with all of the lines that the government has tried to come out with for explaining away the death rate, apart from the speed at which we've gone into lockdown, is that they don't stand up to scrutiny. As you said, there are countries with much higher rates of obesity, there are countries with much older populations, and they also have lower death rates. In terms of Priti Patel's theory, that's because we have so many ethnic minorities. Well, there are more diverse populations in the global north, and there are also loads of countries in the global south which are entirely made up of the ethnic minorities that, you know, are being blamed for the death rate here. So again, that one doesn't really stack up either. I don't envy the job of cabinet ministers having to defend Boris Johnson's decision making on broadcast media, because what are you supposed to do? Tell the truth and say, actually, our chronically indecisive and incompetent prime minister is having to balance the wishes of, you know, his backbench headbangers who think that coronavirus is a hoax cooked up by the Communist Party of China to ruin the West's economy, and scientific advisors who are saying, hey, do you realize that you're killing like everybody in your country? The way he's decided to resolve that is to do as little as possible for as long as possible until it's too late, and then, you know, avert course. You can't go on telly and say that, but that would be the truth. So of course you're trying to pull out any odd excuse out of your ass. And then when, you know, questioned on it, you know, I'd suddenly have an interview with Radio 4 as well.
I'm wondering now if after that their government have got a new excuse to not go back on Good Morning Britain, because you'll also note, I mean, if you're watching closely that interview, what Piers Morgan is saying there and why it's so actually difficult for any cabinet minister who goes on to Good Morning Britain at the moment is because they boycotted the government for 8 months. Every time any cabinet minister goes on to talk about whatever is their, whatever they're leading on that day. So Therese Coffey wanted to talk about a kickstart campaign, getting young people into employment. He's like, wait a minute, I haven't spoken to you since March. So I'm going to bring up everything this government has done wrong since March and make you answer for it. And it means she can't say, look, we've had this conversation before, peers. So all of the critiques that he's built up over the past 12 months, and there are many, get thrown at them all at once. So yes, I don't envy their position, but it's hard to feel sorry for them when they have overseen this human catastrophe. We're going to go to our final story in a moment, which is also it's bizarre, actually, the next one. Before we do that, make sure you do like the video. It helps this show appear in more people's feeds. So if you're enjoying the show, do give it a thumbs up. Another comment, Alice Flago with a $5. It's my birthday today. You guys have been so inspiring in these times. Thank you for everything you do. And thank you for watching and your support, and happy birthday, Alice. Next story. Throughout this pandemic, Britain's political editors haven't showered themselves in glory, whether that's Laura Kuenssberg blaming the public for Tory failures or Beth Rigby lavishing praise on Boris Johnson for following the science. A reluctance to learn the basics of epidemiology has left many correspondents little more than stenographers for those in power. However, one of their number did discover their critical capacities this weekend. You'll find out in a moment who it is. First, we start our journey with this photo. So this was put out by Downing Street of Johnson receiving a call from President Joe Biden. So you can see he's got his thumbs up. He's very happy because apparently he was the first European leader to get that call. Obviously, this government doesn't believe in playing hard to get. This is not like, oh, Joe, you've called me. So nice to speak to you. I was a bit busy, but whatever. This is saying, oh my God, Joe, you've called us. Oh, we're so happy. The special relationship still exists. Anyway, the focus of this section is not going to be the relationship between Boris Johnson and Joe Biden, because this image was tweeted out, was tweeted by an account called Mike Gove 2 with the following text. So he writes, I assume it's a he, laying cable, the excretion of lengths, lying cable, when the phone cord in the mirror is from a different picture after your £100,000 taxpayer-funded photographer has finished photoshopping your spontaneous chat with Joe Biden. Now, as you can see from that image, this tweet is implying that the angle of the phone cord in the reflection doesn't match up with the one that Johnson is holding. And this is now the basis of a conspiracy theory that this was a photoshopped picture. So the Downing Street sort of mocked this up, and because the mirror doesn't match the reality in front of it, something's gone horribly wrong here. Now, most people reading this would think that's obviously a joke, providing you understand how it works when you put a camera close to a mirror. It depends what angle you're pointing at as to where it looks like anything is in the mirror. But if you weren't certain, if you thought that was a convincing story, perhaps, you might have taken a look at the account who posted it. So as I've said, the Twitter handle is Mike Gove 12. And the display name is Michael Govan Reddy. The bio says, I'm not Michael Gove or Mark Francois. And the bio link to goes to what is clearly a comedy video about the Conservatives. It's obviously a parody or a comedy account. And you'd think that anyone with basic social media literacy would be able to recognize this. Indeed, it's precisely the kind of media literacy you'd expect from Britain's leading journalists. In fact, you'd expect it from an entry-level journalist to work out that that was a parody account. However, one of Britain's two most senior journalists was taken in by the wheeze. Here is Robert Peston weighing in. He tweeted, "This is flipping weird. The phone cable should be visible in the mirror descending from Boris Johnson's watch in this official Downing Street picture. It's not. What is going on?" This is the political editor of ITV. I said the second most important political journalist in the country. 3 minutes later, Peston did have a little moment of doubt. Or maybe the angle of the mirror just means it looks as though the cable is going straight down when in life it's at an angle. I am just trying to work out if that's physically, as in physics, possible. Ash, what did you make of this? You know, we're often asking for Robert Peston to be a bit more critical of the government. We didn't realise that when he decided, we should scrutinise the government, it would be these sort of like weird mirror trutherism.
I mean, I think you had it right, which is that this displays a basic lack of internet literacy on the part of one of the most well-paid and prominent journalists in the country. And he's not alone in that. I remember a little while ago on Election Cast, was it? Laura Kuenssberg and Chris Mason and some of the other lot got together to discuss shitposting. And they were so pleased with themselves for having discovered the term shitposting. You could just tell it was written all over their faces. They were like, oh, it's kind of a naughty word. And they defined it incorrectly. And I put out a tweet about it saying why it was incorrect. They got me on the next show to talk about why it was incorrect. And then they also then put up someone from the BBC who said, actually, you're both right, and said that the wrong one was also correct. Which to me was really weird. I was like, why? It's, their definition of shitposting is just wrong. But it is a real lack of instinctive comfort and competence when it comes to reading the sort of layers of irony and joke and parody which permeate social media. Another example of this is Rory Stewart, who got drawn into the Trevor Bastard extended universe. This is a real Twitter deep cut, by the way. A fictional football team called Streatham Rovers. Rory Stewart was first responding sincerely, then clocked that he was part of a gag, and then tried to make himself in on the gag, and it didn't quite work. But you do have a kind of generational issue here. What I don't understand is why, if you were Robert Peston, even if you thought that this was a particularly legitimate halal account, why you wouldn't just think maybe that's a bit of a weird angle, or maybe it doesn't even matter that much. And I think what that indicates is something deeper than just the basic lack of sort of core competencies when it comes to using social media. What it indicates is what they think their job is. It's not to hold the government to account on the big picture stuff, because when it comes to matters of life and death, well, they must all be trying their best. What they want to be involved with is sort of gossip, a very minor, petty scandal, which can kind of nod at their own insider status as part of, the hallowed few allowed in or around the halls of power. And so I think that that's why Peston was drawn to this in the first place to tweet about. It's exactly that kind of low stakes, high drama, petty nonsense that lobby journalists love to talk about. They don't like talking about the important stuff.
Now, you might be watching this thinking, look, Robert Peston is the political editor at ITV, but he's also just an ordinary guy with a Twitter account. Maybe, this is very separate from his job. When he's doing his job, he's asking important political questions. And when he's on Twitter, he's just shit posting in the morning, like maybe we all do on a Sunday morning. Maybe he was hungover. The next tweet, though, shows how relevant his job as a political editor here was. This is, I think, probably the funniest part of the whole ordeal. He tweets, and just for the avoidance of doubt, Downing Street tells me they would never doctor or Photoshop a picture. And as I assumed, it is the angle that makes it look strange. But it is certainly strange. No, it's not strange.
It's the most banal thing on the planet.
But he called Downing Street. Can you imagine being that close to Downing Street? That sort of like you get to call them up just to say that picture looks a bit weird. Is that angle on that phone line correct? Is that really Boris Johnson?
But that's the game. That's the game. You are granted access in return for a certain amount of obsequiousness. And it's not something which is an explicit contract. It's not something which, Peston or Kuenssberg or anybody else is told, which is you will have a career where you get the scoops, you have access to everyone you want to talk about, as long as you're not that critical. It is a sort of drip, drip, drip throughout the course of their careers. You have the right mates, the right networks, the right contacts, as long as you're never that much of a threat to the status quo. And that's why, Jeremy Corbyn had some very competent press officers, but they still never had that same level of full-on integration with the, sort of Westminster, media political industrial complex as the Conservative Party clearly do, because it's much deeper than that and much more entrenched than all that.
For more investigations into the stray thoughts of Britain's best paid political journalists, hit the subscribe button below. Unlike Robert Peston, we can't call up Downing Street whenever we notice something that looks surprising to us in a photo. But we do like to think we hold the Tories to account slightly more effectively on the issues that actually matter. One last thing for you. If you're requiring material proof that the photo wasn't doctored, if you're also like Robert Peston, how could it possibly be the case that in a photo the angle of a phone line looks different than in the mirror it's reflecting in? I have one tweet for you. First of all, let's get up the original photo just so you can sort of remind yourself what's the problem here. What surprised Robert Peston? It's that the phone line is at a sort of 45-degree angle outside of the mirror, and then reflected in the mirror, you can see it's at a vertical angle. Now, to prove such an illusion was not evidence of conspiracy, Twitter user Nick Harrison recreated that scene with his children's Lego pieces. Let's get this up. Now, that is very impressive. So you can see there, the phone line at a 45-degree angle outside of the mirror, reflected in the mirror. It is at a vertical angle. That's because of the angle of the camera. So you see it in the mirror according to the angle of the camera facing the mirror. That's, I mean, if Robert Peston had done that in the morning, I would have been slightly, I'd have been impressed. And I suppose it gave someone something to do on a Sunday morning. Ash, your final thoughts on this particular ordeal. Have you learned something about how mirrors work here, or did that image never look strange to you in the first place?
The whole thing is so dumb, Michael. It's just so stupid and petty. And I love gossip. I love dumb shit. My brain is sort of, just a bricolage of meaningless, trivial bullshit. But even this was too trivial for me. And the thought that on a Sunday, this is what occupies the head of one of the most well-paid journalists in the country. It makes me want to fling myself out the window.
Oh, don't do that, Ash. I hope third lockdown isn't driving you to. All right, let's go to a couple more comments. Chris George with a tenner. Please wish my amazing daughter Keisha a happy 25th birthday for tomorrow. Thanks for the shout out for mine earlier this month and for the great work you all at Novara do. Happy birthday, Keisha. And thank you for that kind donation. And Orla Le Bolt with a $5. It's Isabel Diaz's 19th birthday tomorrow. She is a big fan, loves all your books. Which book? The books in the background, maybe? Or the books that Aaron Bastani has written? Ash, me and Ash don't have books yet. But thank you very much. Happy birthday. We are going to wrap up. Ash, it has been a pleasure as always.
Oh, it's been really nice being here, even though you got me all apoplectic by making me ponder the idiocy of the best paid media personalities in the country.
Yeah, it's bizarre, isn't it? Makes me want a pay rise. I know what mirrors look like. All right. Thank you everyone for your super chats tonight. We'll be back on Wednesday at 7 p.m. Make sure to hit that subscribe button. For now, you've been watching Tysky Sour on Novara Media. Good night.